Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in rural Pennsylvania. Please leave a comment about where you are watching from and when you heard this story before we start. We want to know where and when these documented accounts come in. During the harsh winter of 1890, the small farming community of Milbrook Valley, Pennsylvania, became the center of what would later be known as one of the most methodical. A string of disappearances in the history of American crime. Over the course of 18 months, 7 successful men from the valley disappeared without a word. Local authorities didn't know right away what linked these cases. At first, they thought they were just the normal problems of life on the frontier. At the center of this mystery was Phoenicia Ashmore, a 34-year-old widow who had moved to Milbrook Valley in the spring of 1889. She acted like she had just lost someone and was looking for a quiet place to rebuild her life after her husband died in a train accident in eastern Pennsylvania. Phoenicia rented a small farmhouse on the edge of the valley, about 3 miles from the nearest neighbor. She quickly became an important part of the community. Phoenicia had a unique set of household skills that made her very useful to her neighbors. She knew a lot about herbal medicines. She was a great cook, and the way she treated sick people showed a lot of compassion and understanding. Effectiveness. Dr. Lysander Grimby, the only doctor in the valley, would later say that she knew as much about medicine as he did, especially when it came to treating common illnesses and making natural remedies. Cornelius Blackthorne, a grain merchant who owned a lot of farmland and ran a successful trading business in central Pennsylvania, was the first man to go missing. Blackthorne, who was 43 years old, had been a widow for 4 years after his wife died of tuberculosis. He didn't have any close family, and he got rich by carefully managing his businesses and buying land at the right times during the agricultural boom of the 1880s. Blackthorne's courtship of Phoenicia began in late June 1889 and went on with a passion that even his closest business partners were shocked by. Blackthorne was known for being quiet and practical before, but in the summer he became almost euphoric, talking all the time about his plans to get married and saying that he was sure he had finally found the person who would make his life whole. Tobias Millwright, the local storekeeper, kept detailed records of what customers bought. These records would later help them understand how their relationship was changing. In the summer of 1889, Blackthorne's buying habits changed a lot. He went from buying only practical things to buying expensive fabrics, imported treats, and luxury items that showed how much he was trying to win Phoenicia over with gifts that were far beyond what a typical rural person would buy. Standards. On November 22, 1889, they got married in a private ceremony at Phoenicia's farmhouse. There were only 3 people there to see the service. Dr. Grimby led the ceremony because there was no traveling minister. Tobias Millwright and Cordelia Ravenswood, an older woman who was the valley's midwife and unofficial social coordinator, were also there. The ceremony went off without a hitch. But Ravenswood later pointed out that Phoenicia wore black instead of the usual wedding dress, that she thought it was wrong to wear happy colors while still grieving her first husband. After the wedding, Blackthorne moved his things to Phoenicia's farmhouse, but he kept running his own business at first. In the winter, neighbors sometimes saw him working around the property or going to town to get supplies. By February 1890, though, these sightings were becoming less common, and it was clear that Blackthorne wasn't participating in community events. During one of Phoenicia's trips to buy supplies, Millwright asked where Blackthorne was. She said that her husband had been contacted by business partners in California about amazing investment opportunities in fruit orchards. Phoenicia said that the opportunity needed immediate capital investment and personal supervision. So Blackthorne had to sell his assets in Pennsylvania and travel west to make sure he could be a part of the venture. To back up this explanation, Phoenicia made a letter that was supposedly written by Blackthorne and sent from Sacramento, California. The letters talked about how much money could be made in California agriculture and told Phoenicia to sell the rest of his Pennsylvania property and get ready to join him once he had set up their new business. The letter said that the first stage of development might take a long time because the farming business needed all of his attention, and he had to work with investors who needed careful management of relationships. When Phoenicia showed Dr. Grimby the letter, he looked at it and saw that the handwriting looked like Blackthorn's handwriting on business documents he had seen before. The doctor, on the other hand, was worried about something in the letter's content, but he couldn't put his finger on it right away. Grimby wrote in his personal journal, which was found many years later, that the handwriting looked real, but the words and phrases didn't sound right. Blackthorn's usual direct way of talking to people. Even though they had these doubts, there was no legal reason to question Phoenicia's story about how her husband left. The business opportunity described was plausible, given contemporary reports about agricultural development in California, and Blackthorn was free to make independent decisions about his life and investments. Also, Phoenicia's actions after her husband supposedly left were in line with those of a woman whose the spouse had left to look for work far away. Over the next few months, Blackthorn's assets were sold off without any problems. He sold his animals and farming tools to nearby farmers for fair prices. He also rented out his grain storage facilities to another merchant who ran the business under different ownership. Phoenicia kept control of his landholdings because she said she wanted to sell them according to her husband's detailed instructions once the market conditions were better. When things got better. This process gave Phoenicia a lot of money, which made her status in the community much higher. Instead of staying a poor widow who relied on small-scale farming and rental income, she became a wealthy woman with both cash and valuable property. This change made her more appealing as a possible wife and gave her the money she needed to live well while making new friends. During the spring and summer of 1890, Phoenicia kept getting letters from Blackthorn that talked about how things were going in California and how hopeful he was about their future financial security. These letters followed the same pattern as the first ones, mixing personal affection with detailed updates on business matters and requests for patience as he worked to build their new life. The second person to go missing was Purcell Ashworth, who worked as a blacksmith, whose skills were very important to how the farming community worked. Ashworth, who was 39 years old, had lost his wife in a riding accident the year before and had trouble balancing his business and home life. His first contact with Phoenicia was to make plans for meals because his attempts at cooking had mostly failed. Ashworth's courtship of Phoenicia grew slowly over the fall of 1890, going from helpful to truly romantic. Attachment. Ashworth, on the other hand, quietly and persistently pursued Phoenicia, which was typical of his reserved personality. He showed that he was interested by paying attention to her all the time, helping her with projects around her farmhouse, and having more and more personal conversations about their hopes and worries. It was exactly 1 year after Phoenicia moved to Milbrook Valley that they got married on December 15, 1890. The ceremony was just like her private one. The couple's first wedding had the same witnesses and vows, which acknowledged that life is full of uncertainties and that they might have to go their separate ways at some point. After they got married, Ashworth first kept running his blacksmith shop in town and lived at Phoenicia's farmhouse. But by March 1891, he had started moving his business to her property. He told customers that this new location would be better for farming families who lived in remote parts of the valley. As time went on, Ashworth became more and more cut off from the community because people who needed his help had to go to Phoenicia's farmhouse instead of running into him on their regular trips to town. By May 1891, Ashworth's blacksmith services were almost impossible to get. Customers would go to his workshop only to find it closed and be told that he was working on big projects that required his full attention. When people asked about this, Phoenicia said that her husband had been sick with. He had recurring breathing problems that made it hard for him to work consistently around the smoke and heat of the forge. Phoenicia said in June 1891 that Ashworth had been offered a job as a blacksmith in a Colorado mining town where there was a lot of demand for metal work, and pay was much better than what he could make in rural Pennsylvania. She wrote a letter that Ashworth supposedly wrote that talked about the guaranteed work and higher pay that made the chance too good to pass up. The letter said that Ashworth had left right away to get the job before other blacksmiths could compete for it. He said that the first few weeks would be hard and communication would be hard because of the remote location, but he planned to send for Phoenicia once he had set up permanent facilities and made sure the arrangement was reliable. Dr. Brew Grimby wrote in his journal that Ashworth's departure followed a pattern that was very similar to Blackthorn's supposed journey to California. It was said that both men had gotten great business opportunities that required them to act quickly and leave their wives while they set up shop somewhere else. Even though each case seemed believable, the fact that these things kept happening seemed to go beyond what could be explained by chance. In the summer of 1891, Maximilian Thornfield, a livestock trader who had built a successful business buying and selling cattle and horses in central Pennsylvania, went missing for the third time. Pennsylvania. Thornfield was 47 years old and had a lot of cash on hand because of his trading. He had not been married since his wife and newborn son died many years ago. Thornfield's courtship of Phoenicia started in August 1891 and was different from her past relationships. As a traveling trader, he only saw Phoenicia when he went to Milbrook Valley to do business, but these random meetings seemed to make his attraction because he found her company refreshing after being alone for a long time. They got engaged in October 1891, and they got married on November 28th. After the wedding, Thornfield started to combine his trading routes so he could spend more time with his new wife. He focused on local and regional deals instead of the long-distance trading that had been the focus of his business before. Thornfield stopped trading completely by February 1892, and he told business partners that he was looking into big livestock investments that would give him better returns with less travel. In April, Phoenicia said that her husband had left for Texas to start a huge cattle ranching business using the money he had saved and his trading skills. The letter she wrote talked about amazing chances in Texas cattle ranching, and Thornfield's belief that he could make their money grow by buying land strategically and big farms with a lot of animals. The letter said that the first phase of development would take 18 months of hard work in remote areas where wives couldn't go, but they promised that the separation would be worth it in the end because it would lead to prosperity. Aurelius Winchester, a traveling merchant who sold manufactured goods from eastern cities to rural areas in Pennsylvania, was the fourth man to go missing. Because he was always on the move, Winchester, who was 51 years old, had never been married. Requirements, but he had started to think about the benefits of setting up a stable home base for his business. Winchester and Phoenicia's relationship grew over the winter of 1891 and 1892. At first, it was just a business relationship for buying things that local suppliers didn't have. He became more attracted to her as he saw how smart and sophisticated she was in business, which were qualities that were hard to find in rural areas and were necessary for the kind of partnership he wanted. In March 1892, they got married in a way that Winchester put a lot of money into changing Phoenicia's property for business use and expanding his inventory to serve regional markets. This was both a personal and a business deal. But by August 1892, it was said that Winchester had left for the West to start a business that would help build railroads. Phoenicia wrote letters about amazing chances in the growing railroad industry where guaranteed supply contracts were available, profit margins that are much higher than those of traditional rural businesses. Winchester was said to want to set up permanent operations in several railroad construction centers, which would have required his full attention during the early stages of development. Obadiah Warwick, a miller who ran the important grain processing facility that served the whole farming community, was the fifth person to go missing. Warwick, who was 42 years old, had lost his wife to scarlet fever a few years before and had been alone ever since. Activities until he started dating Phoenicia in late 1892. After they got married in January 1893, Warwick is said to have left for Kansas in May, where the growing wheat industry made it possible for large-scale milling operations to thrive. Phoenicia said that her husband had been offered the chance to build facilities that would serve large agricultural areas with guaranteed grain supply contracts, which would make him a lot of money. Warwick's disappearance caused real problems for farmers because his mill was an important part of the infrastructure for processing grain harvests. Phoenicia, on the other hand, took care of these problems by hiring operators to run the facility temporarily and using her wealth to keep community services running while her husband supposedly built their future wealth. Barnabas Blackstone, a land surveyor who mapped property lines and assessed development potential, was the sixth person to go missing. Him knowledgeable about land values and business opportunities in the area. Blackstone, who was 40 years old, had built his reputation by carefully keeping track of borders and accurately figuring out the value of mineral deposits and water rights. Blackstone's courtship of Phoenicia in early 1893 and their marriage in June followed the usual pattern. However, his supposed departure for Colorado in October to work on surveys meant that he lost specialized knowledge that was worth a lot more than his own wealth. He supposedly took maps and surveys with him that had years' worth of information about development opportunities in central Pennsylvania. Dr. Grimby could no longer ignore the pattern that had started to show up in Phoenicia's marriages by the end of 1893. It was said that 6 husbands had gotten amazing business opportunities that required them to leave right away and be apart for a long time. Each husband wrote a detailed letter explaining his decision and expressing confidence in his eventual success. In some cases, it seemed possible, but the number of coincidences had gone beyond what was reasonable. But Sheriff Horatio Crawford didn't want to look into Phoenicia's situation when Dr. Grimby tried to get local law enforcement to do so. The sheriff said that no crimes had been reported, there was no proof of violence, and there were no signs that any of the men had left against their will. It looks like each husband left real letters explaining his departure, and Phoenicia had a lot of legal papers that explained why she had married and divorced so many times. Sheriff Crawford also said that Phoenicia had become one of the most respected people in the community because she gave money to charity and helped families in need. Any investigation would have to hurt the reputation of someone who is widely seen as helpful to the community's health and well-being. The 7th and last case would be very different from the others. Missing people. In the spring of 1894, Zechariah Farweather, a traveling preacher who worked with small farming communities, started dating Phoenicia. Farweather's religious background made him more aware of spiritual problems that her other husbands hadn't noticed. Farweather and his wife got married in June 1894, after only 6 weeks of dating. Their courtship was short and intense. He said that a lot of prayer had led him to believe that God was leading him to marry Phoenicia and set up a permanent religious mission in the Milbrook Valley. But after only 2 months of being married, Farweather started to worry about his wife's spiritual problems. His religious training had taught him how to spot lies, and he saw patterns that made him feel bad. At first, these worries were about Phoenicia having books and other things that didn't seem to fit with traditional religious practices, and her deep knowledge of herbal medicine. Preparations that went beyond what was needed for everyday life, and her apparent knowledge of practices that had spiritual meanings beyond simple folk medicine. More importantly, Fairweather started to find things around the property that belonged to Venetia's ex-husbands. Some of the things that should have been taken when the men supposedly left for far-off jobs were unique clothes, jewelry, tools, and papers. The presence of these things went against the carefully made-up story of voluntary departures that had explained each of the previous disappearances. Fairweather was most upset by what he saw Venetia's correspondence doing. He saw her writing letters that looked like answers to letters from her ex-husbands, but he never saw her get any mail from these men. When he asked about this seeming inconsistency, she explained that it was because of irregular mail delivery and the practice of writing responses ahead of time, to be ready to send them when the time was right. Fairweather's suspicions grew stronger when he found what looked like draft versions of letters that her ex-husbands had supposedly written, including letters that Venetia had previously used as proof of their voluntary departures. The drafts had corrections and changes in her handwriting, which suggests that she wrote the letters herself and tried to copy the way each man wrote. When he confronted Venetia about these things, she acted very differently toward him. Instead of explaining things or trying to address his worries, she started systematically threatening him to make him doubt what he saw and remembered. She began making him separate meals, saying that he needed them because of his religious work. But these meals often made him feel confused and unable to focus well. Fairweather also saw that his things were being moved or arranged in ways that seemed meant to make him question his memory and mental health. Books were no longer where they usually were. He found documents in strange places, and his personal things were rearranged in ways that made it look like someone had done it on purpose, instead of just cleaning up. The most scary thing was Venetia's attempt to get Fairweather to write to religious groups in faraway places, telling him about chances to start missions among minors, communities, and pushing him to make detailed plans for these kinds of projects. When he refused to take part in what he knew was a plan for his own disappearance, she became more aggressive and desperate in her manipulation. Fairweather was sure by October 1894 that his wife was going to kill him in the same way she had killed her other husbands. His faith kept him from just leaving his wife, but he started writing down what he found and looking for, advice on how to deal with his situation, which was getting worse. Fairweather wrote a lot in his personal journal, which investigators later found, about how sure he was that Venetia had killed her previous husbands. He said he found a secret room under the farmhouse cellar that had personal items from all 6 of her previous husbands. The way they were arranged showed that they were collected rather than just stored. His journal says that this hidden area also had what looked like a workshop for making fake letters with writing supplies, samples of her ex-husband's handwriting, and drafts of letters that were supposedly written by the missing men. Fairweather wrote down that he had found detailed financial records that showed how each husband's assets were sold off after they supposedly left. In November 1894, the crisis reached its peak when Fairweather didn't show up for his scheduled religious service in a remote farming community. Dr. Grimby looked into the matter and discovered that Fairweather had not come home the night before, and that Venetia's reasons for his absence were inconsistent and poorly thought out. Venetia's story about Fairweather's disappearance was not as well prepared as her previous stories about people who left on their own for great business opportunities. At first, she said he had talked about visiting a sick family, but she couldn't say which one, family or place. When asked for more information, she said he might have had an accident while traveling on remote mountain paths. This explanation led to the first official search for one of Venetia's missing husbands. Sheriff Crawford put together search parties that looked at the paths Fairweather might have taken to get to different towns, but they didn't find any signs of an accident. The search also showed that no families in the area had asked for or gotten a visit from Fairweather on the day he went missing. Dr. Grimby was able to convince Sheriff Crawford to allow a formal investigation because Phoenicia's explanations didn't add up, and there was no evidence to back up her story. Law enforcement officials were open to the idea of criminal activity for the first time since the disappearances started. The first step in the investigation was to look at Farweather's personal things at Phoenicia's farm. Investigators found some of his things, found the detailed journal where he wrote down his discoveries and worries about how his wife was acting. The journal had careful notes about personal items he had found that belonged to past husbands, descriptions of the hidden room under the cellar, and his growing belief that these men had not left on their own. With this proof in hand, Sheriff Crawford got permission to search Phoenicia's property thoroughly. The search that took place in December 1894 backed up what Fairweather wrote in his journal and showed physical evidence that clearly pointed to criminal activity. The journal said that the secret room was under a fake floor in the cellar of the farmhouse. This hidden space held a large number of personal items from all 7 husbands, including things that should have been taken when they supposedly left for far-off opportunities. The way these things were put together in an organized way made it look like they were collected on purpose, not just stored. More importantly, the room had. It looked like a full operation for making fake letters, with draft letters that were said to be from the missing men, writing materials for practicing their handwriting styles, and real signatures that had been used as models for making fake letters. The search also turned up detailed financial records showing how each husband's assets were systematically turned into cash after they went missing. These papers showed that Phoenicia had gotten a lot of money from her marriages and had used clever ways to make her control over her victims' properties and investments seem legal. There was also proof that Phoenicia, not the men who were said to have written the letters, had actually posted them from far-off places. She had receipts for trips to different places where the letters had been postmarked, as well as supplies and other things, materials that are consistent with making fake letters. The most damning evidence was found about half a mile from the farmhouse in a remote part of Phoenicia's property, near a grove of mature oak trees. Here, investigators found several graves that seemed to match the number of missing husbands. Digging at these sites uncovered the bodies of 6 adult men who were in different stages of decay. A medical examination of the bodies showed that all 6 men had died under similar conditions, with proof pointing to systematic poisoning as the most likely cause of death. The county coroner saw certain patterns of bone damage that were linked to plant-based toxins. This was in line with Phoenicia's known expertise in herbal remedies and traditional medicine. When Sheriff Crawford questioned Phoenicia, she admitted to killing her husbands in a planned way, even though there was a lot of physical evidence against her. Her confession showed that she had come up with a clever way to getting men to fall in love with her, marry her, and then kill them for their money by slowly poisoning them in ways that made their deaths look like natural illness. The confession also revealed that her time in Milbrook Valley was just the most recent stage of a criminal career that had begun in other places. Phoenicia said she had run similar schemes in at least 2 other places before coming to Pennsylvania. This suggests that she had a lot more victims than the 7 men from Milbrook Valley. But even after many searches of the mountainous areas where Phoenicia said she had thrown it away, the body of Zechariah Farweather was never found. This part of the case that was never resolved raised questions about whether Fairweather might have lived and gotten away, but no proof of his continued existence was ever found. A lot of people in Pennsylvania and nearby states were interested in the trial of Phoenicia Ashmore, which started in March 1895. The case was one of the most organized and the most planned and systematic series of murders in American criminal history, using complex planning, widespread lying, and taking advantage of people's expectations about marriage and family life. The prosecution showed a lot of evidence, including physical evidence found on Phoenicia's property. Her detailed confession, and testimony from people in the community who had seen the pattern of disappearances over the course of 5 years. Dr. Grimby was an important witness because he gave timeline evidence and showed how. His growing suspicions had finally led to the crimes being revealed. The defense tried to say that Phoenicia had a serious mental illness that made it impossible for her to understand what she was doing or tell right from wrong. But this plan fell apart when the investigation found a lot of proof of premeditation and careful planning. The systematic nature of the crimes, the complex legal strategies needed to justify repeated remarriages, and the careful. The disposal of evidence and the creation of detailed financial records all showed that the person was capable of planning rather than being mentally ill. The jury only took 2 hours to decide that the defendant was guilty of 7 counts of first-degree murder. Phoenicia was sentenced to death by hanging, which made her one of the few women in Pennsylvania to be put to death for murder in the 1800s. On August 22nd, 1895, the sentence was carried out, ending one of the most disturbing criminal careers in American history. But even after Phoenicia's death, some parts of the case were still not clear. A lot of the money she made from her crimes was never found, which suggests that she hid or moved some of her assets before she was caught. Also, her claims about past victims in other communities were never fully looked into, which leaves questions about how much crime she really committed. The case set important precedents in American criminal law and helped the law change over time. Understanding of serial murder, especially how people can lie and trick others in their own homes. It showed how vulnerable people in rural areas who are alone are, and how important it is to keep social oversight systems in place that can spot suspicious patterns before they cause serious harm. The farmhouse where the crimes took place was torn down, and the land was put back into farming. People in the area stayed away for many years, and, after short periods of time, several attempts to rebuild on the property were given up. The site eventually turned back into a forest, and the only physical evidence of where 7 men died is the foundation stones that are still there. For decades after Phoenicia's execution, the case had an impact on how police investigate crimes and how the law works. The systematic recording of evidence, the careful reconstruction of timeline patterns, and the combination of physical and circumstantial evidence gave rise to models for future investigations that look into similar types of criminal behavior. The case brought up bigger questions about the social structures and expectations that had let this kind of crime go on for years without anyone noticing. The belief that women were naturally domestic and nurturing, along with a lack of legal oversight of marriages, made it easy for predatory behavior to go unnoticed. Criminologists who subsequently examined the case found a number of things that helped Phoenicia stay hidden. Because her victims were socially isolated, their disappearances were less likely to be noticed right away. In rural areas, there weren't any official communication networks, which made it hard to share information about strange patterns. The general unwillingness to get involved in other people's business kept people from looking in on them. Phoenicia's organized charitable work and community service may have been the most important thing. Involvement had built a good reputation that made it seem rude and mean to criticize or doubt. Her use of her wealth to help the community changed her from a possible suspect to a respected benefactor whose situation few people were willing to question. The case also showed how effective gradual poisoning can be as a way to kill someone when medical knowledge and forensic skills were not very good. Phoenicia's knowledge of herbal remedies helped her make deaths that looked like natural illness, especially in a place where sudden deaths from unknown causes were common and not always suspicious. The systematic nature of her forged correspondence showed that she had a deep understanding of legal and administrative procedures that allowed her to justify getting married again and moving her assets. Her ability to follow complicated legal rules in different places made it seem like she had done a lot of research or had help from accomplices who were never found out. Recent reports on the case said that Phoenicia's looks and behavior did not suggest that she was a criminal. Witnesses consistently characterized her as amiable, supportive, and sincerely invested in the welfare of others. This difference between her public persona and her criminal activities made people question the idea that you can tell who is dangerous by their behavior or appearance. The case had an effect on future legal changes related to marriage, documentation, procedures for transferring assets, and rules for looking into suspicious deaths that happen at home. Some states changed their laws about waiting periods and paperwork for remarriage because of how Phoenicia had used the law to make her marriages legal. The methods of investigation that were developed during the case, especially the systematic recording of timeline patterns and the combining of physical evidence with circumstantial observations, became standard practices in criminal investigations where people think they are committing multiple crimes. The meticulous reconstruction of Phoenicia's methodologies established a framework for recognizing analogous cases in different jurisdictions. Schools started using the case as an example in legal and medical training programs to show how important it is to keep detailed records and spot patterns that could mean systematic criminal activity. People used the case as a standard way to learn about how domestic relationships could be used for illegal things. Contemporary criminologists persist in examining the Ashmore case as an illustration of how social conditions and cultural norms can facilitate systematic criminal behavior in the absence of sufficient oversight mechanisms. The case shows how important it is to keep people in the community aware and connected so that they can spot strange patterns before they cause serious harm. The psychological parts of Phoenicia's behavior are still of interest to academics, especially about the mix of real domestic skills with planned, predatory behavior. Her capacity to offer genuine aid and support to community members while concurrently orchestrating and committing homicides complicates straightforward classifications of criminal personality types. The case also makes people wonder how often similar crimes might have happened when communication was limited and forensic science was still in its early stages. The fact that Phoenicia's method worked shows that similar criminal organizations may have functioned undetected in remote communities across the United States in the late 19th century. Today, the area where Milbrook Valley used to be is mostly covered by forest, and there are only a few signs of the community that lived there in the 1890s. The farming families who saw Phoenicia's crimes either moved away or died, taking their memories of what happened with them. Only official records and newspaper articles keep track of what happened during those 18 months when 7 men went missing for no apparent reason. The case is a permanent reminder that crime can thrive in places where there isn't much social oversight and where cultural norms make it hard to look closely at suspicious situations. It shows how important it is to be on the lookout for people who would take advantage of trust and social norms for predatory reasons, no matter how respectable they seem or how much they contribute to the community. Maybe the most disturbing is the realization that Phoenicia's methods were very effective and only needed small changes to work in different times and places. Her use of psychological manipulation, legal knowledge, and careful planning led to the creation of a criminal business that ran well for years, with the full support and acceptance of the community. The case of Phoenicia Ashmore is still one of the best documented examples of domestic serial murder in the United States. Criminal history, giving us a better understanding of both the methods used by these criminals and the social conditions that help them succeed. It continues to be an important source for learning how evil can hide behind appearances of respectability, and how important it is to have enough protections against people who would take advantage of society's basic ideas about trust and safety.